if we will not do it right now. There will be no people, human resources will just flood Ukraine. So that's extremely important to talk about that in a wartime. So drawing inspiration from the classical feminist studies, I would advocate for a more holistic feminist approach and comprehensive, I would say, socialist perspective, emphasizing human rights and support for vulnerable groups. And from this viewpoint, I believe there are three primary areas of focus to achieve the feminist policies in Ukraine. And first of all, it's inclusiveness, as you mentioned, Andrew. We need to understand actually that Ukraine is becoming a country of people who have very huge aspiration for democracy, freedom, and blah, 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 but also people with disabilities. People literally are losing their part of bodies because of Russia. And if we would be in the same conference with the same topic in Kyiv, for sure there will be several people without parts of bodies, with disabilities, and many more with a PTSD. WHO reports that approximately 8.5 million Ukrainians are at risk developing PTSD and other mental health disorders. Actually, it's very important to address that issue because there is urgent need to develop inclusive infrastructure, offer specialized healthcare, and equip these individuals with a skill set to teach them how to live, love, learn, and work in Ukraine, because otherwise we're not going to make it. Particularly important for us is inclusive education, and that organizations that I'm presenting today, Progressilnia, do an absolutely amazing job teaching Ukrainian educators how to be inclusive. They're organizing camp for replaced teachers, they are doing this training intensives, and I think it's so important, and I'm pretty sure everyone in Ukraine understands that why education matters, because the nation that are reading books are currently winning the nations that are watching TV, and it's important to mention to think about that too. And the second point that I wanted to address is prevention of gender-based violence. And it's actually one of the pictures from the Progressilnia events. You also notice that actually 80% of Ukrainian educators are women. So we need to talk about inclusive education for sure, and we need to allow everyone to get the education despite their abilities or disabilities. The second point that I wanted to address is prevention of gender-based violence and domestic violence. It's not a secret, and I'm sure everyone knows here that Russian soldiers are equipped with Viagra, and raping Ukrainian women is actually a military strategy of Russian. But I don't want to dive deep here because it could be a separate discussion. So I just want to address here that in war times, definitely understand the vulnerability of women and girls to gender-based violence increased absolutely dramatically, and therefore the ratification of the Istanbul Convention and next steps to bring the national legislation in line should be important answer to the challenges that actually women and girls in Ukraine are facing in a war condition. We are very proud that we did it in a wartime, and I think it's also that small victory that we need to emphasize too, not just talk about how bad everything is, because it's bad. No, actually, that Ministry of Education, for example, they have implemented the gender audit, and our Cabinet of Ministry released a law about gender-based budget planning. We'll see how it worked, but I think that fact that we did that steps, it's also very important to acknowledge. The third point is involvement of women in decision-making. I think it will be very crucial and everyone here talking about the long-term sustainable peace, and I think the role of women in this process is absolutely crucial. As I said, we have 60,000 women in Ukrainian army, and they have absolutely unique skills, and they have very deep understanding of how everything is working on the ground and how to make our country secure. And they need to be involved in the peace negotiations. They need to be involved in building this robust defense system in Ukraine. And but otherwise, we will have a lot of women veterans, and we need to prepare a good ground for them, to greet them, to make them welcome, to actually teach them how to live ordinary, not military life, and we also need to address that issue. And I would love to conclude with insights from my friends who are currently on a battlefield and how they think about that. Actually, here on the left, you can see my dance teacher. She's teaching. She has been teaching me pole dance. She's a very famous Ukrainian dancer. She won a lot of competition internationally. She's a very successful businesswoman, and now she is fighting on the front line. And you can see what she wanted to share with us, particularly Ukrainian women fighting shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainian men, because courage, fearlessness, and love for the motherland is not about actually gender, and she proves that. And on the right, you can see other my friends. She used to be a radio journalist, and she made even a video for us. So can we just see it?
Hello everyone, my name is Alla. Previously I was a journalist, now I am a servicewoman of the 13th Operational Brigade Khartia of the National Guard of Ukraine. What I think about women in politics, I think there are over 60,000 of women serving in military now, and we deserve to be presented in Ukrainian politics. We have unique experience, we know the issues, we know the challenges, and I think everybody in society will win if we will be involved in politics more and better.
Thank you, and I just want to encourage you to fight for democracy like Ukrainian women. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. This would end the Ukrainian core of this panel, but we try to keep it balanced, so we'll bring external views as well. But I think what I appreciate immensely that both our speakers try to keep it as real as it gets, and I think it's very important, not only in case of Ukraine, but broadly when we understand that you can implement and agree on various sort of progressive, as Hannah mentioned at the beginning, solutions, but the way they're represented and how they are implemented is a way different reality. And we should keep that in mind, because in theory, we can elaborate very nice solutions. But by bringing this realism, especially even quotes for people who are currently serving in the army and defending with their lives, some of these principles, it's very crucial. And another thing I think for all of us gathered here, I would simply mention that delaying these solutions in the case of Ukraine simply means that they will be solving themselves in a while. And even prior to the full-scale invasion, we have seen that the presidential sort of administration and some of the cabinet, they already had quite a heated discussions with, for instance, army veterans and some of the civil society representatives. And be sure that Ukraine, because as someone quoted said that Ukraine can export revolutions and be a world leader in that, be sure that people will come and get their rights. So in that sense, we should set the platform that it happens in a non-violent dialogue type of solutions and not in a heated sort of internal turbulence. And now I would like to pass the mic to Elena Panchulidze. She's a research coordinator at European Partnership Democracy. She's of Georgian origin, so obviously you can relate to a war with Russia. You can relate to annexation of territories and the brutality, crime, and sort of tragedy, these kind of sort of foreign policy of Russia aggressive brings. But we also ask you to perhaps look broader, not even specifically within the context of Ukraine, but if you could share your own experience and why in these contexts, transformative contexts of post-war, during the war, during different various conflicts, why the feminist lens has an important role to play. Maybe you have a good experience to share, but if you have some negative ones or what should be avoided, would be also interesting to hear. Again, keeping this as close to reality as possible. But please go ahead and share what you like us to keep
Thank you,
them.
Andrei. And it's really a great honor to be part of this panel because, yeah, this is an important issue for me personally, and I can very much relate to the political processes happening in Ukraine. Shall we exchange? Hello? I hope you can hear me well now. So I think also while the brutal war continues and people still struggle, it is very important also to have this forward-looking planning of Ukraine recovery and to make it sustainable by including civil society and the women fully participatory manner in this process. Well, I will go even a bit far than just having a feminist foreign lens. I believe that we need a feminist foreign policy lens in reconstruction of Ukraine, but not just that. And as Hannah was mentioning, it cannot be just about having a few civil society representatives or women representatives around the table. For me, feminist foreign policy needs to be fully connected with wider agenda of democratic reform in the country. And referring to the guiding principles of Ukraine reconstruction, which are embedded in the Lugano Manifesto, all of three, democratic participation, inclusion, gender equality inclusion, and multi-stakeholders participation are all there. Because all three are important, and without having this whole of society approach, including the democratic participation, we risk to have overlooked disparities, and we risk to leave some society, some part of society behind the discussions. And when Andrew was talking in his introduction about having Ukraine not just as a victim, but also the source of inspiration, I think that even during the war, Ukraine showed a lot of commitment to democratic reform agenda. I think very tangibly also evidenced with the preparation of the EU membership application and response to the questionnaire as well. But more specific to gender equality, Ukrainian government also adopted a state strategy for gender equality to reiterate its commitment to eliminate the gender-based violence and empower women participation. But we have many examples also in many countries in crisis and difficult situations where we have perfect strategies in place or legislative initiatives, but they are not implemented in reality. And I believe that this is where civil society locally on the ground in the country and the EU can have a significant impact in the process. For civil society in the Ukraine to have the tools and the resources to monitor the process, that this gender equality agenda is really implemented in the practice, and for the EU to provide enough resources for civil society to empower them, to build their capacity so that they are effective in these monitoring processes. So for me, this feminist foreign policy lens reconstruction goes hand in hand with wider democratization agenda. And in this process, I believe to include as many voices as possible, we need to also focus on democratic innovations. For example, in our organization, also we have European Democracy Hub initiative, and we are looking into worldwide democratic innovations across the world, more than in 20 countries. And I believe that we should bring the examples of democratic innovation, innovative practices of citizens' assemblies, mini-publics, online and offline, different kinds of participation, and embed them in Ukraine reconstruction. Because I believe that these are very relevant to men, but more so for women participation, because this kind of participatory practices can correct the underrepresentation of the women we are having in formal institutions. And one example that I could share from the case studies we have explored is that in the post-conflict reconstruction, the dialogues and inclusion is a bit too formalized, and it really tears down to having people around the table, to have civil society representatives, to have women voices heard, but in my opinion, this should go beyond the representation of civil society, and more kind of gendered approach of broader women participation should be in place. And one concrete example is like talking about the statistics, millions of women had to leave their country. Millions of Ukrainians, but most of them are women. And more than 5 million people in Ukraine were displaced internally. And in the reconstruction process, these women will be returning to the places, or they will have to find a new place to live. And there will be a lot of decisions made at the local level about housing, schools, about healthcare, affordable energy. And in this process, I believe that this kind of democratic, innovative practices can come very handy, so that as many women participate in the process as possible. And last but not least, and this is where I finish my intervention, I believe that from outside perspective, because the reconstruction process is a broad part of the broader context of democratic reform agenda, and also part of enlargement process, I believe that EU definitely has the leverage to foster democratic participation, to foster as many inclusion of democratic civil society, and foster as many participation of women as possible in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and I think it already makes an excellent bridge to the next speaker, but I'll just want to add a very small comment, because when you mentioned the democratic innovation, I think what I would like to see more broadly discussed is where do you put the broadly understood Ukrainian diaspora in the recovery process. And sometimes it's even difficult to define it at diaspora. It could be migrant communities, sometimes it's officially recognized minorities, but there's such a strong network of individuals, NGOs, supporters of Ukraine. I'm just wondering, why shouldn't Ukraine have a strong support network such as Italy has, or Israel, in the world throughout support, lobby, advocacy, but also with practical support. And for some reason, I kind of see it missing for the moment, or recognizing that many women might even remain outside, but we will still have a lot of assets to bring to the table of knowledge. So in that sense, I think it's an excellent remark about thinking about democratic innovation, because there's also a lot of innovation required and flexibility. But now last but definitely not the least, we bring to you Natalie Powells, who's the head of unit Interinstitutional Relations, Coordination of Relief and Reconstruction, Ukraine Service at the DG NIR on the European Commission. And so, Natalie, obviously, you have a bit of a difficult task representing the EU as understood, the whole of the EU. But I think what has already been mentioned by our speakers and Elena, that EU is in a unique position to influence a positive change in Ukraine. I think everyone recognizes, up to Washington, in the new Marshall Plan, saying that the membership in the EU is almost I haven't heard alternatives. Membership EU is the only alternative for Ukraine to have a future, democratic future. So that's a tremendous sort of leverage, which Ukrainian authorities and civil society very well understand. But we ask you also to reflect a bit how you see these challenging tasks, assisting a country that the situation on the battlefield is constantly changing. You need certain dose of flexibility. Then our speakers tell you that there are a lot of different benchmarks, but these benchmarks might need to be adapted as well to actually bring a truly sustainable change in Ukraine. But please share with us maybe all those struggles and challenges, but also the opportunities that you see in your line of work, and how you think about Ukraine now, but also hopefully when the war is won and the peace can come, and that you would support it.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, I think we are now, to all of you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Indeed, to bring in a bit the perspective of a policy practitioner, if I can say. I think it's very interesting to listen to the previous speakers, and I've tried to pick up on, or I will try to pick up on some of the points that are mentioned, but of course, really coming here from the perspective of someone who has been working now for less than a year, admittedly, on issues related to Ukraine. Notably, what my team has been involved in is preparing this new proposal for a Ukraine facility, so a financing instrument for Ukraine for the next 4 years, which we hope to see life breathed into in order to start being able to disperse funds early next year. So this is currently in the interinstitutional decision-making process within the EU. We're talking about an instrument worth 50 billion euros, so really a good amount of money, and in fact unprecedented for support from the EU to a third country. But we are also very much involved in the accession process, so we are coordinating the EU's enlargement chapter as far as Ukraine is concerned, and that report will be coming out on the 8th of November, so an important space to watch as well. So we've got two sort of big things on our plates at the moment, and I think what I would like to come to is this issue of leverage, in a sense. I think it's a really important one, because as sort of donors, we do have potential to sort of leverage a lot of good things that are happening, and also put the right kind of pressure on the government, but also recognize the complexity and the evolving context. And I think you've mentioned there's a need for a lot of flexibility. And we're aware of that, but we're also, what we have seen is that in spite of the ongoing war, the government has been able to implement a lot of reforms that are being put in place because there's a great interest on the part of donors, first of all, to see reforms happen, but also because society in Ukraine is really asking for that. And I think this ranges from, sort of the anti-corruption kind of reforms that are needed. We're talking anti-oligarchization, public administration reform, all kinds of reforms across the spectrum, which are going to be required for Ukraine to become a member of the EU one day, we hope. But also, as I said, because I think that Ukrainian citizens and people living in Ukraine expect and want that to happen and need to see that happen. You mentioned, I mean, somebody was talking about, this is about as real as it gets. And I think that what I can say from the time that I've been working in this area is that it is very real. I mean, what's been mentioned by some of the previous speakers is sometimes the disjointedness between policy frameworks, which might look very good on paper, and then actual implementation of that on the ground and how that really impacts on people. And I think that what we're seeing is really, of course, the need to continue developing both. And this is where both the accession process, but also this new financing instrument are tools that we can have to leverage that impact and to really push for the kind of reforms that are needed. So I wanted to mention, for example, that at the sort of really the policy framework level, in relation to this new Ukraine facility proposal, a huge part of the funds will be directed towards supporting the government's budget. So this is really classic, well, not so classic, and I'll explain why, budget support to a third country. But we are coming with something quite new. We're basically saying we expect the government of Ukraine to develop a plan of reforms and investments that it will undertake over the next 4 years, which will then include conditionalities, and our payments will be against actual performance. We want to see progress being made in each of these areas of reform and investments. And this is how we're going to make sure that we're exerting a certain leverage and pushing things in the right direction and keeping things on track with the government. We are asking for something realistic. We, of course, cannot set the bar, so high that in the end we will not be able to disperse funds. So we're looking very carefully at the kinds of timetables that we can attach to different types of reforms and investments. But we're working closely with the government. But a really important point is that this is Ukrainian-owned, this plan. It's required for them to have access to the funds, but at the same time we're saying, this is your plan, you need to decide which reforms and investments are in there. But at the same time, we're also saying, we expect you to consult. We expect you to consult society on what is going into this plan. We will be looking as Commission at what you bring to the table in terms of this plan, and we will ask you about how you have consulted and who has been consulted as part of that process. And so in a way, this is going to be sort of an iterative process going forward now to make sure that we have a plan that will really bring about change. So you might be wondering sort of what is the feminist perspective? I'm mentioning reforms and investments. We're talking about reforms really that cut across a very wide range of sectors, but also, I mean, a lot of important things, including, for example, public administration reform, which includes things like salaries for government officials. And there you have the issue of you know, equal pay and all kinds of important things that matter for achieving gender equality, for example. We're looking at human capital as a sort of a broad area of focus for the plan that will look at also, you know, how are we rebuilding in a way that takes into account, you know, marginalized people, groups that will have suffered, people coming back from the war. There are all of these different elements that need to be brought in. As I said, the idea is then we will have certain conditionalities attached, and we will be making payments on a fairly regular basis over the next 4 years against the kind of progress that we expect to see and that Ukraine commits to achieving as part of the plan. There is flexibility. I mentioned already. We know that, I mean, this is a tall order already for any country, but a country at war, we need to recognize that situations may evolve. We need to be able to continue doing what we've been doing until now, which is mainly helping simply keep the government running, making sure salaries are paid for civil servants, for teachers, for the health sector, etc. But what we would like is, as we all hope, that the war will come to an end, sooner the better, of course, and that this will be a positive victory for Ukraine, that we will then be able to adapt the plan as things move ahead in order to be able to perhaps have more in the area of investment, looking at liberated territories, being able to rebuild while keeping a lot of focus also on reforms. Now, the other thing that I mentioned is that we have the enlargement process, the accession process. I think there is a big expectation, or a lot of anticipation, I should say, of what the Commission will be recommending in the report that will be coming out, as I mentioned, on the 8th of November. Recommendation to our member states as to whether we think that it is time to open accession, proper enlargement negotiations with Ukraine. So as you know, right now, Ukraine is an accession country, but the decision still has to be made as to whether we're going to really start accession negotiations. Well, that decision is going to be taken, we think, by the end of this year by our member states. And that will open up a whole sort of new process, again, discussion around reforms, and really saying now, I mean, if your aspiration is to join the EU as soon as possible, this is going to mean a need for a big push across the spectrum in terms of the kind of acquis that you need to put in place to approximate the EU acquis. I mean, the kind of legislation and reforms that are needed. So we see these two things coming together in terms of the support, financial support we're providing, backed by a lot of technical assistance and capacity building, and at the same time, the EU accession process itself, which really is a kind of a process which maintains a lot of engagement and a lot of pressure, in a sense, on the country to continue with those reforms. So I've tried to keep it real. I don't want to go on too long because I do want to allow for some questions, but I think at the moment, I mean, I would maybe leave it there and just pass back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. And of course, we'll go straight to the question. I only have one quick comment, but I think what has also shown at this panel that very much the feminist lens is something like a domino effect. It overlaps with a lot of issues, so it's not an isolated. So if it as it real as it gets, if it's our motto of today's discussion, it is very real in all the different dimensions. And I think also what has to be mentioned, well, there's the leverage of the EU, but also there's a lot of work to be done by the Ukrainians themselves, by the civil society, by the government. But again, rest assured, there's a lot of investment and ownership of the process and readiness to go ahead with it. That is one thing. And I also think that although we have today a discussion around Ukraine, and some even might say that there's preferential treatment in the worst case scenario of Ukraine or whatever. I mean, I think it's a wrong mindset, and I would encourage us to see this as Ukraine and EU developing a certain know-how. Basically, I think we already passed the modality where we see our neighborhood as a ring of friends. It's a ring of fire, unfortunately. In a sense, the conflicts might be more different, military, non-military, hybrid ones. But the way EU develops, adapts, and flexibility with Ukraine having that kind of an enemy, Russia, it can then be effective in other regions of the world. So you should see it as a certain knowledge sharing and understanding how to navigate in an increasingly polarized world, and not as treating Ukraine as a standout case that gets something more. So I think the positive is needed. But again, excuse me for taking the time. So I think we still we're a bit over time, but we also started a bit later. So maybe I take initially 4 questions. I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So 2 men, 2 women, ideally gender balanced. Because we have 4 speakers, and then we come back if we have more time. And please, if you have a specific question to a specific person in the panel, you can address it. If it's a general one, also please go ahead. So I think it was 1, 2, 3, 4.
Good afternoon. My name is Sofia. I'm a Ukrainian feminist, independent consultant based in Brussels. And I have 2 questions to Halina and Hanna. Particular on situation in Ukraine, and maybe a bit a contradiction to you as well. So the first one is around the fact, because you are trying to bring a narrative, or at least the one I try to understand, is that it doesn't matter who you are at the front line, a woman or a man, the conditions are the same, which I think that I would disagree with. And yeah, I see that, but I would just want you to explain a bit more, because I think it also might be valuable for the audience here, because we know that recently Ukraine has released a special uniform for Ukrainian military, and I mean, to my wonder and question, it took 1.5 years of the war, which I think is way too long, considering how many women we have there and how much it's the question of security. And it's also a question beyond men and women. We have people of color, we have people of different religion, we have people of LGBTIQ community, and that also creates special conditions. And I don't mean that they are not delivering good at the combat, but more in the fact that it's our responsibility to make sure that they do not need to have any obstacles to deliver well. And that kind of leads me to the second question on sexual and gender-based violence, and it might be a bit a controversial question, but I feel like it's the platform right now to ask, because we talk a lot about sexual gender-based violence with Russian military, and we cannot really educate Russian men at this stage. But there is also one happening from Ukrainian side, also in the military. And it's the question to you, if anything has been happening from Ukrainian side to be able, because again, 1.5 years in war, workshops, anything, training to kind of educate Ukrainian. I know that might be not the question that is top of an agenda of Zelensky, but maybe of Ukrainian feminist civil society movements on the ground. But also to people here in the audience, because we have Ukrainian military men coming to the EU to get trained on how to deal with know-how, weapons, and so on and so forth. But are those also educated on sexual gender-based violence, for example, and other topics? Because I mean, some of them come for a month to any of the EU countries, and we have some countries like Sweden, the US, who have more experience with women in military and for sure can share more experiences on how to deal with these sensitive situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Viktor Avdochenko, I'm an associate professor from Ukraine as well, and also one of big volunteers, but also advocate in the academic and science community. I would address my two questions to Elena, but mostly to Natalie. Definitely, we are all expecting not only the report from November 8, but also what we say the summit, where we're going to be opening the negotiations possible and see it happening of the member states. As you say, the preconditions there that the EU acquis is being very much implemented or embedded. We do have some achievements in that, and I just wanted to mention to this audience is about 70% of the association agreement of Ukraine is already being implemented. So we are a very progressive country in terms of having a battlefield in physical, informational, cyberspace, but also progressing with the reports. You mentioned public administration reform, which is one of the most painful reforms in all of the countries who were applying to the EU before, and those who were progressing now as Ukraine. So to what extent you want literally to see the advancements in the public administration reform, which was very much dear to my heart prior coming to Brussels? And second questions, if I may, to what extent you see the implementation of the feminist lenses in some of these reforms, what you were already addressing in some, Natalie, of your opening remarks for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Luca Barocca from Just Access. I had a question to the whole panel because I found this very interesting because I felt like it has also some different perspectives, because I felt like at the beginning we talk about the possibility for Ukraine to lead this progressive change in the EU, but then we also talked about the fact that in Ukraine right now in the government women are underrepresented. There are concerns from a feminist point of view. So I felt like Ukraine might not be the best country to lead this change, considering the accession. So my question would be, should Ukraine be the best country to lead this example, or should instead maybe the EU set out stricter accession requirements in this regard? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Willy Kokolo. I work at the European Commission as well, but in DG EAC, which is the department responsible for culture. I just wanted to bring a cultural perspective to the discussion because, I mean, we do a lot with our colleagues from DG NEAR in terms of reconstruction, because there's an aesthetic value to what we can do to Ukraine to support the creative and cultural sectors right now. And in all our endeavors, be they formalized or informal settings, when we try to recruit Ukrainian expertise, in most cases, the experts recruited were female ones. And it's not because we're trying to do some kind of gender washing or feminist washing or whatever you want to call it. It's because those people were the best. So in the cultural sector, it's really the female persons that are the best. Now, there are two distinctions that stick to my mind. The first, I think it was you, Hannah, putting it to the fore. You made a distinction between perception and legislation. So my question to you is, how do you perceive a feminist lens in the cultural landscape, especially because it's mostly associated to a softer approach to reconstruction, as opposed to a traditional male-centric focus in military aspect and harder power? And the second question relates to another distinction that you made, Elene, distinction between representation and participation. Do you have concrete examples of what a feminist or a female participation would bring to such settings? And that also links to the video message of your friend Halina, when she was mentioning that there is definitely issues and challenges that are known to the female participants that should be brought into the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So maybe we go ahead with a similar order, starting with Hannah. But our time officially has ended, but I'm the moderator, so I extended it. And I'll deal with my colleagues in an office setting later, I don't know. So, but please, if it's possible, slightly more concise than your initial input, because there's also supposed to be a break after this panel. So Hanna, but everyone can reflect either on a specific question addressed to you, on anything you find relevant and you would like to respond. Thank you.
Very briefly, because questions quite interconnected. First, about the culture. It seems to me that we are speaking about the more general debate that is currently in Ukraine, the balance between the physical reconstruction, roads, bridges, hospitals, and the societal reconstruction. And here within the presidential team, because many of them came from the entertainment industry, they are emphasizing that even during the war they need to spend the money for the culture, and how they see the culture, that's another question sometimes. But they constantly repeat the words of Winston Churchill, that if we are not investing in culture during the war, for what we are fighting. So here you have this understanding in the society, if more about the cultural institutions. Another question is that because of all those women that left the country and what been spoke, will they return back? Yes, so there are much bigger amount of questions that should be raised in terms of the societal reconstruction that just balance between the hard power and soft power. That's understanding that weapons cost more, but at the same time, I don't see that somebody put under the question, for example, that the destroyed church or the museum should be reconstructed as soon as it happened. The question is from where to take money. And as for now, many cities choose the way of searching external money. For example, the main cathedral of Odessa that's been destroyed by Russians in July, Italians are paying for this now. They brought their architects and they promised to pay this money. I know that Greeks promised for some other places. So that is more the question of, do we see alternatives? Are we trying to get more people? But in terms of understanding, it is on the ground. Then it is about the, are we example or should the EU lens? From my perspective, at least experience in the past, that should be both. We should not one get from the other. Let's not see it black and white. A lot of the reforms Ukrainians are doing because it is the certain requirement. I remember these requirements for the visa-free regime. Just make these requirements clear and understandable. So as soon as I remember those, how many points we had for the visa-free regime, but there were plenty that we couldn't understand what they have with the visa, like it's not about documents, it's not about the border, they were about corruption or something like this. It worked perfectly. Because it was said by the foreigners, it was easier to sell for the politicians, civil society had the instrument how to follow, it worked. So that's why the question is just not to make everything as the requirements from the EU, otherwise EU will be seen, or European Commission, as some bad cop instead of the partner. And here you also need to care about this. Gender-based violence and training for UN military, I know that this issue is raised by the general staff. I'm not sure about the foreign training, but inside of the country, that's the question that is discussed. I know that a lot of the training is happening about the Geneva Convention, and the fact that it is part of the Geneva Convention, so I mean it's always there. And I haven't heard about the serious cases. I mean maybe they existed, but it's not something like what we really see in other conflicts. I don't remember any international organization that, as for now, claimed that there were cases with the Ukrainian armed forces, but maybe I lost. At the same time, what is interesting that at the occupied territories, men. Because Russian society is so patriarchal, they think that women, you're not a threat for us. That's why we have more partisans females than male, even that for their personal safety there are much more risks. But when we interviewed many of them, they said, Russians don't consider us as a threat on the street. When in Kherson, now I can speak about this woman because she's already at liberated territories. In Kherson, the woman of about 52, 53 years old, I mean, she's not the brave activist or something. You would see her in the very housekeeping style of the mommy, with 2 kids of around 15. She was putting the posters and graffiti in the most important places and went at the most dangerous times. And he said, But when they saw me, they never could imagine that that graffiti 5 minutes ago was done by me. So I went, and why not? Why my son should risk? He is more in this risky group from the Russian perspective. So that's why, that's also work these patriarchal stereotypes of the Russians in our favor sometimes. And probably Galina will go for the presence of male and female. That definitely was not we wanted to show, that there is everything like this, that it doesn't matter. It matters. The question is what matter.
Sure. Yes. Thanks for answering the question. Actually, that was a quote from my friend, and she imagined that we need to that she need to address that quote for us. What she particularly put in that, I cannot wrap you here because that was just a quote. But definitely, I don't think that we are in that discourse where we're saying like that woman uniform and man uniform is the same. Like, I'm very much into that discourse. My friends were doing a lot of work and research to create a special body armor for Ukrainian women because it's need to be like a special shape, special weight, and like I don't think that we need to get that discussion here. In terms of representation of like the question, to address your question, we had that, obviously you know that we had that quota for women in politics like 60-40, and because of that I know a lot of absolutely bright, brilliant Ukrainian women who have been able to be in politics just because of these quotas, and they are advocating for Ukraine, advocating for special ammunition and underwear for Ukrainians for Ukrainian women in their cabinet. So, and I think we will see more and more this shift into for women. And what I was trying to explain and what I'm advocating for, to involve women in the army for this peacekeeping process, because it's crucial. They have extremely unique knowledge, and we need them to build our robust defense system, because otherwise, without them, who we put them? Like men from the cabinet? No. Why women who are fighting are not in this process? Like, I don't get it. That's why I think we will be doing our progress, maybe sometimes slightly, maybe sometimes we will not be the example, but I think it's just such a unique case that could be that example, and I do believe in that.
Andrei, can I just one thing that I remembered, why we said that not always we need to, like, how to say it, we are mixing things sometimes. For example, about the female in the armed forces, we are thinking that it is a gender problem. And sometimes the issue is not in gender per se. Why I started from the research that we needed. The research of Invisible Battalion in 2016-17 demonstrated that we couldn't have females at the certain positions in the armed forces, not because there were restrictions or prohibitions for women to be there, but because the labor code didn't allow women to keep heavier equipment. And for example, a certain equipment is more than 30 kilos or something like this. And somebody in the Soviet labor code, and we still had Soviet labor code at that time, wrote that you cannot carry the work if you need to carry some heavy stuff or wherever. So it was absolutely from the different sphere, but because your share is, military share is more than this number of kilos, you couldn't be in these particular forces. So is it gender problem? No, that is the problem of the old labor code, but then it became a gender problem.
Okay. It's on? Okay. Very quickly about the enlargement question. Well, I think, of course, enlargement is conditioned to democratic conditionality and reform agenda in all the three Eastern Partnership countries, in Ukraine as well. Ukraine is a special case because together with reform agenda, the country is in war currently. But I still think this is a political decision of member states, and that there is no kind of formal answer what would be the percentage of public administration reform that would give Ukraine candidate status. I think in this process, there are two very important things that Ukraine has. First, the dedication of the public, and it's shown in opinion polls and dedication of the public for fighting for European values and for democratic reform agenda, and the trust of on the European counterparts, trust of the Ukrainian authorities that they are also committed to democratic reform agenda. And the question about representation and participation, I think there are two levels. First is that there are legal instruments and legal measures so that women are represented. For example, gender quotas. I know it's controversial. Some people may argue that this is not brilliant. Sometimes with gender quotas, some women end up to be represented just because of quotas, but I believe that this is a very good starting point. So it's very important that there are in place certain legal measures so women are represented, so that they don't just represent and participate, but they have legal footing in executive and legislative branches to actually influence the decisions. And the second one is more formal, more informal, that I already mentioned when it comes to democratic participation at the local level, when people in different kind of citizen assemblies, mini publics can vote for particular decisions that can influence their life at the local level.
Thanks a lot. Maybe just pick up on a couple of points. I mean, I think that, Professor, one, maybe, we hear this quite a lot, that Ukraine has already implemented 70% or certain percentages of the acquis. Simply a word of caution. I mean, the Commission does the formal assessment of where we feel Ukraine is in terms of approximation of EU legislation. Other bodies, other groups have also done sort of their own independent assessments that might come to different conclusions. So it's simply to say that I think that in terms of what the member states will be looking at, they will be looking at the Commission's official enlargement package, the report on Ukraine, and we'll be really going through that to see, you know, what it is that we have to say in relation to each of the chapters of within that report. So the results might be slightly different than the ones that you've mentioned. On the other hand, I think there has been good progress. I mean, you maybe all know that the Commission, when Ukraine applied for membership, the Commission had to come out with an opinion, and as part of that opinion, we set out what we consider to be the 7 sort of essential steps that Ukraine would need to first meet, in a sense, in order for us to consider positively opening of the actual negotiations. That process continues, so there has been really good progress. Still more to come, we hope, but overall, I think that things are on a good track. Your specific question was about how much do we really want to see public administration reform advance. I think there, I would point to the preparation of the Ukraine plan in relation to the facility that I mentioned, where public administration reform is really one of 5 underlying enablers. It's really considered absolutely essential even to be able to use all the funds that we would have available over the next 4 years and beyond that, and also linked to the accession process. So there's a lot of emphasis. It's about, as I mentioned already, remuneration, so pay, recruitment and selection procedures, which could bring in also sort of obviously gender considerations, but also capacity building. It's been mentioned already. There's really a capacity issue, and there's going to be potentially even more of a capacity issue as you have all of the donors coming with funding that will go into projects in Ukraine. Already we see a lot, but with more funding coming in, you know, we're going to have a huge need for people with certain skill sets to be able to actually ensure that we can implement all these funds. That is, of course, then a risk for the public sector, as sometimes, let's say, international financial or institutions coming in and setting up offices to implement their projects might recruit from a limited pool of people within the government with expertise. So we're aware of those kind of issues, and those are the kind of things that we'll be wanting to pay a lot of attention to. And that links, of course, also to the fact that many women have left the country. How do we provide incentives for women to come back to Ukraine to enter those kinds of roles? someone mentioned, what can the diaspora, in a sense, do to sort of help? I think that there are programs that can be put in place and are already being put in place to help train Ukrainians who are based outside of Ukraine, to get them, skilled, so that when they go back, if they choose to go back, they can also contribute in these kinds of ways. So there are a lot of different things happening around this broader issue, but it's all somehow interconnected, and there are many different players that need to be involved in sort of making sure that, that we're not seeing sort of almost negative impacts of otherwise very positive engagements in the country. So we're really talking to a lot of different stakeholders, trying to bring in the gender lens, in a sense, and also mainstreaming into different activities. Just to give a very practical example, the Ministry for Restoration is developing a prioritization methodology for the selection of projects, reconstruction, rapid rebuilding kind of projects. And we have been working quite closely with them to, on the development of this methodology. And as part of that, there is sort of gender impacts brought into the discussions. So we have an EU-funded project, EU for gender equality reform or something like that, that is also there, that is at the service, in a sense, of the government for, helping them think through, what does it mean? How do you do gender mainstreaming? How do you go beyond putting nice words on paper and actually having it make a difference in terms of actual implementation of actions, as the one I mentioned. Stricter accession requirements. I can tell you that the order is already very small for a country wanting to accede to the EU. Again, I would invite you to look at the report when it comes out on the 8th of November, the Commission's accession, the report, the package. You'll see that gender is really coming out in that report in a lot of different ways. So take a look at it, and I think we would always invite comments and concerns, because this is the beginning of a process for Ukraine, and I think that we're really willing to listen and hear from you as well about how we can improve things. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, apologize for running out of time, but hopefully it's worthwhile in terms of time's investment. One technical message and one very short conclusion. So I think this shows the hunger for discussion. I think it's just end on to be continued. Also remembering that whatever the advances and achievements we have, what the COVID pandemic showed, or any major conflict, has shown that anything we achieve can be rolled back in a matter of weeks, months. So it's always a constant discussion. So it seems that we have to embrace ourselves, and definitely don't let those regimes, be it Iran, Russia, the one in Belarus, having the upper hand and showing that this value-driven approach that we have, what we share together, can persist for a very long time. The technical message is that my colleagues told me that 45 minutes, but perhaps now it's less. So everything that criticism goes to me. So yes, I apologize. But thank you. So now it's a lunch break. Thank you.